Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Michael Ulrich, Director of NYU Washington, DC, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's event, The Israeli-Palestinian Conflict, How Can It Be Resolved? Continued political divide, negotiation stagnation, and unwavering distrust are only some of the many obstacles in the conflict between the Israel and Palestinians. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas have not reached a deal, nor does this seem to be likely in the near future. This evening's program will solve that, or will feature a discussion to delve into some of the conflict's issues surrounding border settlements and security, refugees, and of course, Jerusalem. I'm honored to greet our two panelists tonight. James Zogby co-founded the Arab American Institute in 1985 and continues to serve as its president. He is director of Zogby Research Services, a firm that has conducted groundbreaking surveys across the Middle East. For the past 3 decades, he has served in leadership roles in the Democratic National Committee and served 2 terms as a President Obama appointee to the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. He writes a weekly column published in 12 countries and is featured frequently on national and international media as an expert on Middle East affairs. And he also did his Zogby TV show from our very own studio, so we're happy to have supported him in that way as well. In 2010, he published the highly acclaimed book, Arab Voices. His 2013 ebooks, looking at Iran, the rise and fall of Iran in Arab public opinion, and 20 years after Oslo, are drawn from his extensive polling across the Middle East with Zogby Research Services. Joining him is Avrum Burg, Speaker of the 15th Knesset, who was born in Jerusalem in 1995. Following his 1955, I gave you a little head up there.
I was going to say you didn't age well.
Amazing.
Following his military service as an officer in the paratroop division, he became one of the leaders of the protest movement against the war in Lebanon. In 1985, he was appointed by then Prime Minister Shimon Peres to serve as his advisor on diaspora affairs, a position he continued in until 1988. That year, he was elected to the Knesset, and once again in 1992 until 1995. When he was elected chairman of the executive of the Jewish Agency for Israel and the World Zionist Organization. He stepped down from this position in 1999 to run for the Knesset and was elected speaker. Perhaps most importantly, both of our panelists have taught successfully and wonderfully at NYU with our own students in this very facility. So please join me in welcoming them tonight.
Let me start, Avrum. First of all, it's a pleasure to meet you. I've followed your career.
No.
I do. We had a delightful little chat in the green room. Speaking as an American, to you an Israeli, I want to say that I was thinking about this. We have a lot in common. Both of our countries. My dad always said, if you speak softly, people will listen. And my mom had a corollary to that, which was, you're wrong at the top of your voice. So I tend to be soft, I'm sorry. I said we have a lot in common. Both of our countries are being led by individuals who have gone over the deep nationalist end, have been inciting against minority communities, are under threat of indictment, have attacked their judiciaries and the media, and create a very worrisome situation, both here and there. I just wanted your comment on how you are seeing the situation in Israel vis-a-vis the elections coming up and Netanyahu's increasing trend toward authoritarianism.
The pleasure is mutual. I, for years, follow and monitor the Arab voices coming through the Zogby's vocal cords, okay, which is fascinating, both the authenticity of it and the processing of it. And I'm grateful. It's interesting, it's fascinating, and for many more years to come. First, about the elephant in the ballot box, which is, you said we have 2 leaders. Not at all sure. most of Israel, not most, 99% of the Israelis, but my wife, myself, and some of our children, not all of them, believe that every 4 years, 300 million Americans are going to the ballot box in order to exercise the democratic right to elect or to appoint, to elect the best president for the Jews. Okay, that's the concept that we have about American presidency. So whomever sits in the White House is actually the, as we used to say in Iran, is the supreme leader of Israel, okay? So we have the president, and then we have the Israeli prime minister. So this is how the chain of command is working. Some of them, which are very bad for America, like George W. Bush, are the best for Israel. And some of them, which are the best for the world, are being perceived as bad for Israel, like President Obama. Having said that and having the map in place, I will say as follows. Netanyahu is not just the individual. Very talented. I suspect, I don't know well enough your president. I mean, nobody knows him well enough, not even he himself, because him of the morning is not the same of him in the afternoon. But nonetheless, Netanyahu is a well-read person. Trump is a well-written about person, okay, but not necessarily well-read. Netanyahu is a well-read person with a philosophy. His philosophy corresponds very interestingly with Samuel Huntington of the Clash of Civilizations, and he believes in the George W. Bush intellectual interpretation of Huntington, assuming there is one like that, which says, here we are, the children of light, going to combat or to fight or to defeat the children of darkness. It is us, the Demo-Christianity, versus them, the Muslims, whomever, and demonizing the collective out there. And therefore, the philosophy of Netanyahu, which falls more or less into these categories, is always to be to the side of light, to the side of Demo-Christianity, underlining Christianity, especially its evangelical fundamentalist interpretation, and therefore siding with the most conservative value systems and political systems in the West.
You know, what's fascinating about that is a master's thesis by a young man at San Francisco State University back in the 80s. I used it in part of my dissertation. And not in my dissertation, it was after that, in some of my writings. He was writing about the foundations of the school of neoconservatism. And he made a connection between it and the Jonathan Institute that Netanyahu had founded to honor his brother who was killed at Entebbe, and had invited the very architects of American neoconservatism to that conference in the late 70s. And he connects the intellectual thread of neoconservatism with Christian fundamentalism. Both of them are manichaeistic. Both believe that there's forces of good, forces of evil. Both believe that there's the inevitability of a clash and the inevitability that the forces of good will win. And so the only thing ever holding back is the will to confront. Yeah. And both of them share that view. The Christian right, who have their heretical theological notion of the conversion of the Jews, the ingathering, the conversion, the coming of Jesus, the end of the world, etc. And while George Bush was not a member of that, he became captive of that with Cheney and Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz and company sort of projecting that on him. And Netanyahu, on the other hand, did not become captive of it. He was one of the architects of that.
Is it?
Yeah. And so what you said about that Jews feel that way, there are a whole lot of people in America who do the reverse. Whoever gets elected in Israel becomes the best, and the American president is judged as somehow subservient, or do they do what's best for? And I remember one time having a conversation with Lord Levy. He had a calling card that said the Lord Levy, which is kind of cool. I kind of wanted something like that for myself at one point.
Sir Michael.
He was asking a Washington Post journalist. We were at a lunch at the British Embassy, and he asked the journalist, he said, I don't understand your people. He said, in Britain, the Jewish community is Labour or Tory. And Labour sides with Labour, and the Tory sides with the Likud. But he said, in America, he said, the establishment in the Jewish community went from Rabin was the best ever to, oh no, Perez is even better, to, oh, Netanyahu was the best ever, to then to Barak, and then to Sharon. And one by one, they fall in line behind whatever leader without any sense of ideology. Now, you were sort of managing the thrust of the views in the Jewish diaspora. How did you see that? I mean, as an Israeli who had a particular point of view, is it difficult to deal with the Jewish establishment because of their falling in line with whoever gets elected?
Next question, please. Okay. There used to be a Jewish establishment. Today is a kind of a shadow. I mean, many people are individuals and thinking in terms outside of so many boxes. Okay, the box is not containing any boxes anymore. The Jewish establishment sounds very, very good, but look at people. Can you define Bernie Sanders as a Jewish establishment? Not even a democratic establishment. I'm not at all sure even that our establishment is what he is. And look at the circles of youngsters around him. Many of them are coming from Jewish active circles. It's not the establishment. It is something else which is very committed and very devoted and very innovative, but not establishment. So the unaffiliated, the political unaffiliated are getting stronger and stronger. On the other hand, the more conservative, the more orthodox, the more observant you become in the Jewish circles, the more you are identified with these conservative political values. Having said that, I'll say I would like to comment in a couple of layers. The first one is we never seriously addressed the issue of dual loyalty. Mm-hmm. But there is no doubt of American Jewry. There is no doubt there was a dual commitment, a dual emotion. I mean, there was a kind of, wow, we love whatever happens over there. Part of it is this still, the demons waken up during the Holocaust and the feeling of so many at the American Jewish establishment, we could have done better during the war. Why didn't we put more pressure on the political system here, the political system here, to prevent some, to bomb some, to intervene earlier or whatever? And part of it is the euphoria. And you're an American Jew, you have a kind of solidarity with the rest of the Jewish world, those perished and those grew out of the ashes. 48, 67, 73, oh, Gewalt. Okay, so Israel produced so many emotional peaks and hypes that in a way it defined American Jewry in a sense. Recently we are moving to different places. Here is the dilemma. I will ask an average American Jew, who are you? Give me a profile. He or she will tell me, I'm egalitarian. I believe in the constitutional wall of separation between church and state. I really want to be fairer distribution of public resources. I believe in the fairness of the game. I believe in diversity. I believe in tolerance. I believe in repairing the world. I said, well, you're a mainstream Democrat. You take the same values of this individual in DC or in LA or wherever it is, and you copy-paste the values to Israel, and all of a sudden, the same individual with the same Jewish identity, with the same democratic commitment, is a no-goodnik, well poisoner, Trojan horse, stab the back of the nation, or Avrum Burg. All of a sudden, you are a traitor. And now this shift between the value system of the Israeli society, which is becoming more and more nationalistic, and the value system of the average American Jew, or American liberal, which is becoming more and more tolerant and more sensitive, created such an abyss between the two, or is creating such an abyss between the two communities, that the younger you are in the Jewish community, the less committed and the less emotional devoted you are to what used to be the source of inspiration, the State of Israel. And therefore, what you describe is very generational.
Let me talk about my polling for a bit, and the polling that others have done, which I think is quite important at this point. Let me begin with a New York Times op-ed that appeared on Sunday, which if you haven't read, you should. It was Michelle Alexander, front page, if you get the actual newspaper, which I do, of the Week in Review section. It gave, really huge, prominent display, saying, it's time to break the silence on Palestine. And she talked about Israel's history of oppression of Palestinians. She talked about the efforts to silence opposition voices. She talked about the need for those who, like her, leaders in the civil rights movement, to break the silence, to do what Dr. King did over the war in Vietnam, and to speak out and challenge. Well, the reaction was hysterical in an effort to demean, smear her, taint her, call her an anti-Semite, etc. But what's interesting is that what Michelle Alexander was pointing out is something that has been brewing in American life now for the last 20 years, that she finally helped break to the surface. I've been noting in polling, and we've all been noting in polling, Pew does, Gallup does, that they call it a partisan split on the question of Israel. Pew famously noted that in the most recent poll, the percentage of people Democrats who identify with Israel versus those who identify with Palestinians are almost equal. First time ever. It's usually 3-1. Now it's almost even. What Pew and the others have failed to note is that that is actually a demographic split, not so much a partisan split. It's young people, it's African Americans, Latinos, Asians, who those three groups are about a third of the American public, and it's the educated. And on the Republican side, it's also a demographic. It's white, middle class, middle age, and largely born again. 41% of people who self-identify as Republican now are born again Christian. It's that demographic split that is defining the turf in the political debate today, which is why Bernie Sanders, when he ran in 2016, attracted so many young people and did something that nobody since Jesse Jackson had done in '88, spoke about Palestine. And when he did it hesitantly at first, but then came to realize that there was a constituency there. I remember the Brooklyn debate when he mentioned it and challenged Hillary, and he got such overwhelming response from the audience, he doubled down. And that is continuing to brew. So we have this deep partisan split right now that I think that the Jewish establishment, if there is one we can speak of, simply doesn't know what to do with. They have become so wedded to Trump. Netanyahu is so wedded to Trump that they just don't know at this point how to maneuver themselves in these murky and troubled waters. At the same time, if you look the polling that we've done over in Israel-Palestine, another interesting dynamic is taking place, and that is that I remember, 10 years ago, as late as 10 years ago, people used to say, we're 5 minutes to midnight before the two-state solution is over. I now think we're like 15 minutes past midnight. It's over. Physically, I don't know how you separate and create a viable Palestinian state without an Israeli civil war, which I don't think there's anyone in Israel who wants to lead, to force hundreds of thousands of settlers out of their homes. At the same time, the opinions of both societies are further apart than they've ever been. Palestinians in the last poll literally have given up on the concept of a two-state solution. They just don't see where you do it. The Jewish opinion is also turning against the two-state solution. But then when we ask the follow-up question, what do you envision as this one state? The Palestinians say the one state should have equal rights for everybody. And the Jewish opinion largely was we should expel them to Jordan. It would be one state without them. They don't see them as having equal rights in the state, either cantonized within without rights or sent away. And so these two dynamics are playing out, an Israeli-Palestinian complete bifurcation as to what the solution is, and an American debate between a right and a left that are increasingly finding less and less common ground on how to approach it. I mean, I'm reading today an article that says, by the former U.S. ambassador to Israel, Dan Shapiro, Democrats can save the two-state solution. And I wonder what he's smoking, thinking, drinking, how he's imagining that this would happen. You could save it conceptually by having a statement saying we support it, but how do you do it is the issue. How do you do it when there's no Israeli government anywhere on the horizon that would implement it? And I just don't find either society ready or able to implement such a construct.
You know, they ask why the deliberations in the Knesset are so long. And the answer is because everything was already said, but not by everyone. So I'd like to repeat exactly what you said because I fully agree with you. So I want to do it again, but I'll do it with my own words with your permission, okay?
Punctuation on it, that's good.
Yeah, no, I fully agree with your reading and your analysis, though I think you are very kind, and as your father said, you speak softly. The two-state solution is dead. It's not minutes away, not resuscitation, not any emergency. It is dead. There is no product in our consumering society with no expiration date. The only product in our life which has no expiration date is the two-state solution. It will live forever. Forget about it. It is dead, and something magical happened to it, as if David Copperfield is running the state of Israel and made the occupation disappear. Whoops, hocus pocus, abracadabra, no occupation. Nobody talks about it, neither us nor the Palestinians. I mean, they talk, but it's not a political issue. And in a way, even in Ramallah, they got used to this devil, and in a way it functions. And therefore, for me, the discussion is not anymore to keep alive the verbal two-state solution, which became, in a way, a safe haven for people who do not want to move. You say two-state solution, voila. On one hand, literally, you are a liberal, but on the other hand, you take no risks.
And you absolve yourself from responsibility of doing anything.
None whatsoever, because you committed yourself verbally to a two-state solution. However, the real discussion is about what kind of one-state solution is happening, no will happen, is happening. As for today, for 50 years, as much as lefties like me ran around the world and told you good people, hey, it's next week, it's around the corner, it's the last moment, Obama is coming, Obama is going, Clinton is coming, Clinton is going, next week something will happen. As much as we sold you a feeling that it is temporarily and next week everything is over, it is not over. And for 50 years, we, the Israelis, introduced a one-state solution with two regimes between the Jordan and the Mediterranean. One regime with absolute monopoly and total hegemony of the Jews, not even the Israelis, because 20% of the Israelis are non-Jews, Palestinians, but total and absolute monopoly of the Jews over every privilege, territorial, resources, rights, expressions, politics, power, you name it, without relinquishing a millimeter to the other side. And the other regime is the regime for the Palestinians, which are totally deprived from their basic democratic rights. Israel complains why my Israel, my beloved one, the one I'm struggling to change, the one I'm struggling with, and is struggling with me. why the entire world is against us, why the UN passes so many resolutions, etc., without actually looking into itself and saying, voila, we are the only Western democracy, this is how we define ourselves, who occupies another nation for so many years in spite and despite the free will and motivation. This is why you are criticized. If we were living in Yemen, maybe we were not that we would not have had this kind of criticism. But we're not. We claim that we are part of this world. And this world behaves under a different normative system. Then comes the second element, and this is, I believe that a paradigmatic shift is necessary, both for us and the Palestinian and the world. In brackets, I will say, I do not believe in the notion which says, since the Middle East is so chaotic and the turmoil and the whirlwinds are such, so we should defer this problem and not deal with it till the whole place will settle down. I say, on the contrary, that's an opportunity to settle it differently and more creatively, and maybe later we'll come to the concepts of the solution. One thing is for sure, I stopped counting states. 1 state, 2 states, 5 states, 20 states. I stopped counting states. I count rights. That's the only thing which counts for me. And the one thing I'm struggling for, article by article, demonstration by demonstration, political action by political action, is to introduce the notion, which is still young, still fresh, people do not yet understand it, but very simple, that between the Jordan and the Mediterranean, every individual has the right to have the same rights. That's it. Once you have this, on this fertile ground and soil, you can grow so many better, positive growths.
You know, you agreed with me. I'm going to now repay you the favor and agree with you. I started in Washington with the Palestine Human Rights Campaign. I did it because at the time when I came here in the 70s, neither Amnesty International or actually anyone else would touch a Palestinian human rights case. They would say it's difficult for us. We'll lose support, and we don't want to risk our status in Congress, et cetera. So we started our own, and we took individual cases, and we fought for human rights. And we didn't get involved in the political formulas because others did that. We advocated no home demolitions, no administrative detention, which is you arrest and hold somebody without charges for a prolonged period of time, sometimes as much as 4 years. No collective punishment, no torture in the prisons, which there was plenty of. And we worked with Israeli attorneys, and we actually did a lot of work on that issue. And then, things developed, and we moved forward. And during the Oslo period, I worked with Vice President Gore in a project to build an economy in the West Bank and Gaza to support the two-state solution. And I now say I've come back to where I was. The issue is human rights, the issue is equality, and the issue is justice, plain and simple. And what gives me great hope is that demographic split that we talked about is beginning to show itself in this way. A group, Jewish Voice for Peace, for example, or a group, If Not Now, groups in the Jewish community are raising these issues of human rights. And in Israel, I noted just in the last week, there was a demonstration that was Arab and Israeli against what has been, I think, appropriately called the apartheid road, a road that Israel built. One side is for settlers, one side is for Palestinians, and there's a huge wall in between, and they block traffic on the road. There was also a video that's been circulating by the same Israelis and Arabs combined, challenging the notion of separating passengers, Arabs and Jews, on Israeli buses. You have to show your ID as to where you sit. They don't want people sitting together. It's a problem. And those joint actions and the movement that is developing here, and Michelle Alexander's piece, give me some hope that this issue, as early as it is in its development, as you noted, is gaining some traction. It makes sense, in particular to young people, that there has to be a focus on equality, justice, and human rights.
Since I agreed with you and you agreed with me, let me disagree with myself, okay? Otherwise,
And
we
then
can
I'll
go,
disagree with my...
yeah,
no.
yeah. So we can go like that forever. You're right. Something develops, grassroots, bottom up, something generational. Something is developing. What it is, the size of it, the energy of it, the power of it, yet to be seen. The following argument is coming, and I say it as a warning to myself, from the point of view of the privileged. I'm a privileged individual. I'm a Jew. I'm an Ashkenazi. I belong to the elites. I was born to purple blood family, which means blue blood mixed with red blood, so gave it a purple blood family, okay, because my parents were quite socialist, but one of the best families of Israel, I mean, in the eyes of us, of course, not in the eyes of the others. So I'm a privileged Israeli, but not only this, I'm privileged because I'm post 70 years of independence and sovereignty, and I can think about it in a very, I will say, saturated way. I had it, I have it. It looks like quite solid, so let's push the envelope a little bit. And when I say the following sentences, especially to my Palestinian friends who never had a moment of independence, a moment of freedom, a moment of tranquility, it's not fair. So everything I'm going to say now is coming from the privileged point of view, understanding that it's not fair. Yet, I think that the next chapter is the following chapter. And the entire chapter is dedicated to Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt writes during the 50s to one of the German, Professor Gershom Scholem, German historian, German Jewish Israeli historian. She says, I'm not married and I'm not faithful to tribes or to people or to genetics. I'm a patriot of ideas. For me, the conflict will not be resolved if it will be a waiting, a permanent, eternal waiting for all of us Israelis to talk with all of them Palestinians. That will take forever. The same way I do not see any conflict anymore between automatically it's all of us versus all of them, because if something happened, automatically we are the good ones and they are the bad ones. I believe the solution and end of some of the conflicts will come with the understanding that it is some of us and some of them, good people, committed to rights, dignity, respecting the pain and the traumas of the others, versus some of us and some of them who are extremists, fundamentalists, violent politically, spiritually, or physically. Only at the day in which the partition lines will not be a line between Israelis and Palestinians, but between some of us and some of us versus and some of them versus some of them and some of us, only then the beginning of the conversation will start. And part of the problem up until now was the futile waiting for the both collective to come to an agreement, and I think it's impossible.
Yeah. I don't see where you disagreed with yourself, but I agree with that disagreement. I want to shift gears for a moment to the other side of this conflict, the Palestinian side. I almost don't know where to begin. The authority, the Palestinian Authority, so-called, it's an authority without authority, has become a total dependency. when I did this work with Vice President Gore in the 90s, what we were doing was trying to promote an economy which we found couldn't be developed because of the absence of the right to freedom of movement within the territories, but the inability to have access and egress from the territories. We brought over American companies who said, we'll open a business in Gaza. We'll build furniture and export it to Eastern Europe. Our factory right now is in Italy. This would be cheaper and closer. We'll do it from there. They couldn't get the right to import raw material and export the finished product. They had to work through an Israeli middleman, or they couldn't get the contract. That cut into the profit margin, and so it went out the window. There were so many of these that we tried to do, we couldn't do, and it is a problem that remains. One of the reasons why some folks have depended upon, when they want to grow the Palestinian economy today, high tech, because with doing software, you don't have to import and export. It's all done virtually, so you can do it electronically without crossing a border. Even within the territory, you can't develop economies of scale by producing a product in Hebron that you then export or then sell in Nablus, because the transportation is too unpredictable and too difficult to manage. So you end up with duplicate little an Aspen factory in Ramallah, and one in Hebron, and one in Nablus, and they can't merge and grow and develop even with an internal market. And certainly Gaza is completely cut off, so there's nothing there. As a result of having no economy, the two single largest sources of wealth for Palestinians are day labor jobs working on Israeli settlements, or getting a permit to go across the border into Israel. And these are day labor jobs. You don't get a job in the settlement and live in the settlement. You don't get a job in Israel and live in Israel. You have to, it's like, migrant workers in Southwest LA. You line up in the morning to see if you're picked, and then you get trucked in, and then you get brought back at night. And the wages are miserable and the conditions are horrible. Or you work for the authority. Tens of thousands of people. When we started, after Oslo, the public sector didn't exist in the West Bank. Today, it's the largest source of wealth. And so I almost don't blame Mahmoud Abbas for not wanting to take risks to compromise international donors, because that's the whole economy. Not the whole economy, but it's the largest source of the economy. At the same time, it is rife with corruption. And it's not, and nepotism and a whole bunch of other ailments that occur when you take a captive people and under prolonged captivity and under prolonged duress. You're going to see all kinds of aberrant forms of behavior. Then we go to Gaza and Hamas. We polled in that election when Hamas won in 2005. We asked a question. The question was, if you believed that peace were possible, who would you vote for? 73% of those who said they were voting for Hamas said they would vote for Fatah if they thought peace were possible. They simply didn't think peace was possible, and so they chose to throw the bums out and give somebody else a chance. The problem was that Hamas behaved irresponsibly when they won and decided that they would continue to function as a guerrilla movement with armed resistance, which basically meant, I believe, terrorism, and ended up sabotaging their own chances, sabotaging the newly elected government, and creating even deeper rifts within the Palestinian society. And so the dysfunction within the Palestinian polity, which I have to say, and I don't know if you'd agree with this, I put the blame for this on the occupation authority, which created the conditions. I mean, it's sort of like if you look at what happens in an urban ghetto situation, do you blame the people in that situation, or do you blame those who created the conditions that created prolonged poverty and desperation and a lack of hope in young people who see no option but to carve out this block and say, this is my turf and you better not come, and they get into gang war and they end up with killing and drugs and a whole bunch of illegal activity. Today, one of the biggest problems in Gaza is suicide and drug addiction. Young people who were taking their lives, committing suicide by committing acts of terrorism, are now killing themselves straight out. And at some point, I could point my finger and say this is corrupt leadership, and it is. But it's corrupt leadership that is preying off of a absolutely desperate situation. And so when I hear the administration say, well, the Palestinians aren't sitting down and talking with the Israelis, who could sit down? I mean, do we actually think that Mahmoud Abbas could make a deal even if he were to sit down? Because his position is basically he is the handler of the money that comes from the international community and taxation to distribute it out to public jobs to keep people in line. He's become the administrator of the occupation more than he is the leader of the Palestinians. And again, I have to blame the true authority, which is the occupation, for having created this distorted reality that Palestinians have been living under for too long. And so that leads me even more to the solution that we talked about, which is that there has to be, as you said, a different frame of mind and a different coalescing around a new idea, and also a new constituency that can actually project a different solution.
I'm reluctant because who am I? I'm the occupier. Okay.
I can say it.
Yeah, okay. I enjoyed every word of what you said. I mean, why did you stop so early? But I'm the occupier as much as I fight my system and I take positions, etc. Who am I to judge them? Who am I even to pass any kind of evaluation? I mean, would I have behaved differently under these circumstances? I'm not at all sure. Now, I'm an individual who twice a month goes to Ramallah, which is not legal. So a couple of weeks ago, it was Friday afternoon. Shabbat was already in, but with my friends, it takes time. I mean, they have a watch with some 16 hours, a watch, not 12 hours. Okay, it's a longer time there. Time takes time. So it was already in the middle of the holiday of Shabbat, and I'm driving through the checkpost of Kalandia. And usually they stop you, the Israelis, and ask, where have you been? Now, there is a village right inside the wall. It's as if the Palestinian side, but it is Israeli territorial sovereignty called Kafr Aqeb. It's a no man's land. So you say I was in Kafr Aqeb, so they cannot actually tell you anything because it's legal, it's Israel. So whenever I go to Ramallah, when I come back, they ask me, I say, it's Kafr Aqeb, yalla, pass by. It was late, and I was angry, and I missed the Shabbat dinner with my family, and nothing went right in Ramallah. So he stopped me, this young man at the checkpost, and said, where have you been? I said, yalla, fuck off. I mean, I'm not going to lie to him. I mean, he's 20 years old. I'm a bit too older than him. I said, I was in Ramallah. What are you doing in Ramallah? You know, it's a crime. I can put you to jail. And he started shouting at me, wow. And I look at him and look at him and look at him. And then, I mean, he ran out of energy, out of steam. And he said, what did you do in Ramallah? I said, listen, young man, I belong to a group of people who would like to Judaize Ramallah. So we explore plots and real estate opportunities in Ramallah. We want to buy them in order to create a secret Jewish settlement in Ramallah. He said, Wallah. I said, Wallah. He said, please go by. Why do I stop you? Okay. Now, this is the guy who stands in the middle of between the two realities and has no clue, none whatsoever, what happens the other side of the barrier. There are real life there, fantastic, cultural, full of tension, but very attractive, not in the sense that I want to live there, but you don't feel despair. You feel something else, especially in Ramallah, which is a kind of, if I use American terminology, it's one of the coastal cities. It's not inland, okay? A little bit more to, I mean, not San Francisco, but, okay, but not Midwest.
But there's a huge Ramallah community in San Francisco, so they must have...
This is why I mentioned, okay?
Yeah.
Okay, it's fascinating. Having said that, I have to add one more thing. Mahmoud Abbas and his circle and circles are my friends. And I belong to the generation who, I tear my hairs, okay? How the hell we Israelis do not understand that this is the Palestinian peace camp? Mm-hmm. We know what was there before. We can speculate what is coming after. It's a unique opportunity. And maybe that's the reason why the Netanyahus do not want to move, because that's a very unique generation, and Mahmoud Abbas is a serious, solid leader under all the pressures he goes through. Yet, Jim is right, the Palestinian Authority became the subcontractor for the Israeli occupation. They run the occupation for us for a cheaper price. Security, they do for us. Some torture, they do for, interrogations, they do for us. Not Guantanamo style, but Nablus style, Jericho style, okay? Paying the activists, they do it for us. They maintain the system for us. And that's a shame. Mm-hmm. Having said all of this and all of that, I will say something like this. I already hear different voices. So many years. The most dominant Palestinian discourse was Israel, 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 Israel. Never looking inside, never criticizing constructively what happens in their own society in order to build it differently. Now with the younger generation, which graduated after the Second Intifada, understanding that the violence of the Second Intifada damaged and harmed the Palestinian society and the Palestinian cause more than it damaged and harmed the Israeli society. Second guessing, second thinking, well educated in the West and in other places. Just the immediate past Palestinian ambassador to Washington, Hussam Zumlut. An amazing, educated, smart strategist, an amazing individual, which is part of a larger group of Palestinian strategists and activists, already looking inside and saying, what is it in our hands that we can fix, correct, build, and rebuild before we go out and blame the rest of the world? And for me, that's a new opening. Not yet wide, but you hear these voices the same way I hear these voices, and I see an opportunity there.
I don't disagree with that at all, and I do believe that Israel did everything it possibly could to undercut Mahmoud Abbas. I remember when John Kerry was trying to restart negotiations, and Mahmoud Abbas was literally begging for the last prisoner release to keep them going. It was 25 people. Netanyahu said no, but then shortly thereafter negotiated with Hamas a prisoner exchange where he gave Hamas 1,000 prisoners. He did everything he could to weaken him, to discredit him with the negotiations with Hezbollah, the negotiations with Hamas, and then gave Abbas nothing but sullied his reputation here in the West as an insider, etc. And yet, all that said, the reality is that that the authority has become what it has become, and I don't know the extent to which it can resuscitate itself and be able to. Well, let me say that the argument is they need to do this in order to negotiate a two-state solution. That we've agreed is off the table. The question is a different kind of vision for the future, and Palestinian leadership need that different vision. They need the vision of building a mass movement for substantial change. And with that in mind, I want to turn the corner to the BDS movement, which has been vilified, called anti-Semitic, calling for the destruction of the state of Israel. But on the other side, its architects say it's the one nonviolent response we have to this occupation. I mean, violence didn't work. And incidentally, in our polling, we find that one of the few issues that both Israelis and Palestinians agree on is that Palestinian violence has been counterproductive. Palestinians agree overwhelmingly with that. Has Israeli military and settler violence been counterproductive? Israelis don't agree, Palestinians do. But Palestinians agree with Israelis that their violence has been a failed and wrong strategy. The BDS movement, it's become illegal in Israel. You have members of Congress here wanting to pass legislation to make it illegal here. It's illegal in 25 or 26 states now to support it. Every once in a while you read a story in a newspaper about a woman who wanted to get a job in Texas and couldn't because she supported BDS, or a woman in Kansas, a math teacher, she's a Mennonite, she supports it, her church supports it. They denied her a contract teaching math. People in Texas wanting to get FEMA funds had to sign a statement that they did not support the BDS movement, and some people were denied funds, and that also became a court case. There's a number of states now where the ACLU is challenging this, the legality of this. But the effort to criminalize nonviolent protest and free speech, and to exclude people from even visiting Israel, including Jews, who support the boycott movement, has become the issue of the day. I mean, there's still, sitting in the Senate a bill calling for the criminalization of this behavior. And in Israel itself, it's become a big issue with groups being denied access to international support and people coming in and visiting, et cetera, if they support the BDS movement. And so the question of what strategic approach can Palestinians and Israelis who want peace take if this one tool, which is to boycott or to encourage people to divest or to call on governments, et cetera, to sanction. The Irish government today, or was it I think it was today, the the lower house, passed a Senate bill that had come to them, that still has to go through another round of passage, overwhelmingly passed it, to not have Ireland import any goods made in the Israeli settlements. As the person who wrote the bill said, if we as a government say settlements are illegal, then we can't come back with, okay, but how much is that wine you're making in that settlement? We want to buy it. If the settlement is illegal, then the product is the fruit of an illegal activity, poisonous fruit. And so the debate on this issue, do you want to comment on it? Or?
Sure. I'd like to do two things. I'd like to comment about the BDS, because maybe if I will say my real feeling about it, maybe I will be denied a re-entry to Israel, so I can stay here for longer. And this is before I told you.
Not if the Senate bill passes.
No. Let's see. I mean, maybe they opened the administration today, so the best dealer in town is dealing with that. I mean, what do you know? And the second, I'd like to offer a structure for the future relationship between the two communities. So I'll divide my non-allocated time into two, okay? I'm a great believer in conspiracy theories. I mean, I'm driven by it. Some of them I invent myself, some of them I support, the rest of them I spread around. As my father used to say, how do you know that a rumor is a good one? I mean, how do you know that this rumor is a good one? Start spreading it around. When it comes back to you as a fact, it's a very good one. Okay? So I believe that it is Benjamin Netanyahu personally who founded the BDS movement. By the way, I've no doubt about it, not yet proofs, but I'm there, I'm getting closer. Listen, in my entire political career, and I've been to some garbage cans, I mean, I've been to some places. I've never seen such an effective bullshit in my life as the BDS movement in Israel. More money is spent by the Israeli governmental budget to defeat the BDS than the combined budget of the BDS movement plus the damages it will cause to Israel in the next 25,000 years. But we love it. Listen, we love it. We need an enemy. Obama killed Iran. Wallah, this stupid agreement. I mean, we could have Iran forever. Now he signed this agreement. Iran is almost off the table. Thank God we have Trump. He brought it a little bit back, but his HDD doesn't allow him to stay too long on the topic, so it's not really not a solid policy anymore, okay? So, okay, we don't have them. Let's fight the Palestinian Authority. It became so weak. Thank God we discovered the tunnels. So now we blocked all the tunnels. We have the kites. So the entire Israeli might, with the most powerful air force in the Middle East, with 200 denied nuclear bombs, fighting kites. Voila, they're going to demolish the state of Israel. From Hitler to the kites, there is a direct line. Now, every now and then that all the enemies are in vacation, we have BDS. You can always trust the BDS to be a good enemy. They're not going to disappear. Low energy, as the president said, but always there, so we can always bring it back to the front of the table and fight it a little bit. What is this BDS? The Israelis are coming to the Palestinians and say, listen, Palestinians, let's have a kind of a modus vivendi that we can both live with. Terror we don't like, so please, don't put bombs. It's not good for you, it's not good for us, and it's not nice. Okay, let's say Palestinian, no bombs. Suicide bombers, we tried it for 10 years during the 2000s, no good. Okay, no suicide bombers. Don't go to the UN, this is a diplomatic terror. Okay, so no diplomacy. So now they came with this very creative, ineffective BDS movement. And Israel say, no, don't do it. It's not nice. We don't like it. We know what is boycott. We were boycotted by the Nazis, and we are traumatized. We were boycotted by the Arab boycott. We don't like it. Boycott is not nice for us. Says the Palestinians, so what is that for me? I say the BDS is a very legitimate expression of civil, non-violent disobedience. Legitimate. I would have done the same. I don't buy any product which is produced at the settlements, and I'm one of those who send a letter to the Irish Parliament, signed a letter to support the new bill, all over. Now, as a dialogist, I'm against boycotts, but I understand the emotion behind it. It will not lead through a domino effect aspired by its initiators to sanction Israel like South Africa was sanctioned. And therefore, it remains at the margins of civil society. Feel good about it. Why will it not lead to international sanctions? In America, because the American political structure, we covered it before, and in Europe, because of Germany. As many as European governments and parliaments and civil societies and NGOs and whatever will support it, as long as the Germans will veto it, and the Germans will permanently veto it, at least for the next couple of generations, you will never have a European position. And there is no real European position without Germany in the midst of it. And therefore, the BDS is a nice-to-have toy in the hands of Israeli right-wing politicians. Has no effect, none whatsoever, besides the fact that there are a couple of universities who do not invite left-wingers, pinkos like me because I'm an Israeli. Okay, very effective, but I have other ways to express my voice. I think it's legitimate for the Palestinians, has no harm for the Israelis, and being exploited cynically by the Israeli right-wing conservative government. Another sentence, this is about the structure of solution, back to what we spoke before. I do not want to leave the room with the feeling of we are doomed to live like that forever without thinking about some new thoughts and offering some food for thought. For us, for you, for whomever watches us beyond this room. And it should be a combination between the motivation of both sides to live in the place, partly separated and partly cooperating. And I see a three floors political solution. The ground floor is the one I described already, and this is the constitutional one, that between the Jordan and the Mediterranean, every individual has the right and will have the right to have the same rights, regardless your gender, your faith, your ethnic belonging. You're an individual, your human rights, and we count rights, and we do not count something else. The mezzanine floor, you will have two political entities. The Israeli one, in which most of the Israeli Jewish issues will be resolved, and the Palestinian one, in which most of the Palestinian issues will be resolved. Will it be a state? Will it be a national community? Will it be something else? I do not know. It will be a political entity. And on top of it, the third floor will be the confederation in which both sides either delegate or relinquish, delegate responsibilities or relinquish some of the rights to the joint governing body to run whatever is possible to run together. Let's start with infrastructure, environment, later go on maybe to some dimensions of the legal system, trying to help each other with having a better educational system, educating towards the other rather than against the other, and on and on and on. The shared society will start at the third floor. And I believe that this confederation is possible. The Israeli and the Palestinian society are closer than any other societies in the Middle East today, because of occupation or despite the occupation. But we are that close. We understand each other. We speak the same language in a way from the other side of the same moon. But we speak the same language. Political one, muscle one, or whatever. And therefore I believe that this structure, the three-floor structure or confederation solution, is maybe the only opening toward the new paradigm of running this issue together.
I'm not going to speak to that final proposal. Not because I would disagree with it, but because we are so far away from realizing it. I do want to comment, though, on both societies understanding each other. Because you made a comment earlier about the young man at the border, at the checkpoint. And I thought immediately of an article my son wrote actually 2 decades ago when he had just finished graduating from the University of Virginia Law School, and he got some foundation grants to start a project called...
you sound so Jewish. Wow. Jim.
He got some grants to start a project in the West Bank called Palestine Peace Project. It brought lawyers over to do rule of law, human rights, and work with institutions. Some were law students who'd worked on the Hill, and they worked with the Palestinian legislature to help write legislation. Some worked with some of the human rights groups, and some worked in institution building and civil society. He did it for 3 years and came back at one point, worked at the State Department. But while he was at the State Department, a couple of the Jewish establishment groups found an article he had written in the University of Virginia Law School newspaper. It was an open letter back to graduates. It was the 50th anniversary of the State of Israel, and it was an open letter from him saying, here I am. I'm sitting in a bar in West Jerusalem, surrounded by Israeli kids. And he said, as different as we are, there's so many things that are the same. We're drinking the same beer. We're listening to the same music. And we also live in a city that is very much alike. My city, Washington, and your city, is Jerusalem. He said, I grew up in Washington. And it wasn't until he did some work with the Jesse Jackson campaign, it was the first time he'd ever been to Anacostia. And he said, most of my peers, most of the kids I went to high school with would never even imagine going to Anacostia or going anywhere across to the other side of Washington, D.C. And yet, in their mind, they think of it as one city. And yet, we're not one city. We have no idea what goes on there. The infant mortality rate in Anacostia is higher than it is in parts of sub-Saharan Africa. We have no clue at all, nothing, zero. It doesn't it doesn't exist for us at all, and as a concept even. It's like we know what the map looks like, but we don't know them. We don't know there. And he said, I'm 5 minutes away from there. Most of my peers have never been. They're sitting here in West Jerusalem, 5 minutes away from the other side. They've never been there either. And yet they see it as one city, but have no clue at all. That was viewed as anti-Semitic, as anti-American. How could he be at the State Department, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they got a congressional letter to have him fired. He didn't get fired. Madeleine Albright pleaded with him to stay, whatever, and he did. And it's a long story. But I actually don't think that's changed. I think that problem is still there, that and to the extent to which the wall has created a sense in Israel of security, it's even created even a greater sense that we don't have to know them. And the roads that have been built that, people drive through Palestinian areas, just drive through. They don't even know that they're there. It's like, being on an interstate highway. You don't even have to deal with them at all. And the only time they meet is in this master-slave dialectic relationship. I remember being at the border in Gaza and watching this is back when Gaza was open for day laborers, and there were cattle chutes. They were like cattle chutes. They were about 6 feet high, and the soldiers would straddle the chutes with guns, and the Palestinian day laborers who were going in would have to line up in these chutes to go through and be checked before they could go. And I noted the Israeli soldier, a young kid, shouting, "Don't look at me, don't look at me. Hold your ID up, put your head down, don't look at me." So I wrote a piece when I came back called Fear and Anger. And it was about the Palestinians who put their head down and looked subservient and afraid, but were seething with anger. And then there was this soldier who was barking orders at them, who manifested anger, but was actually deeply afraid. And this is the master-slave dialectic relationship. It's you call me sir. It was, so many of the lynchings that took place in the South were because blacks were acting uppity. And they couldn't do that because it created a fake sense of equality for the white who felt threatened by it. Don't look at my women, don't look at this, don't do this, put your head down. And so it was, yes, massa, yes, massa. And that, unfortunately, is the nature of the relationship for too many. And so I am not opposed to efforts to create a dialogic interaction, but I do believe that, as a young African American said to me when we were doing some work in Philadelphia around race, he said, "I don't want to marry your daughter, and I don't really care if you like me. I just want my rights. And after I get my rights, we can talk about the next level of the relationship. But if you can't respect me as a human being and give me equal rights, then I can't go to the next step." I understand that they have to go together. Sometimes the dialogue has to come, but I'm looking at this years off. I mean, before we get to the point where We even have in Israel a mindset that says we want to have a confederation, or that pushes them. What I like about BDS is that it's a discussion starter, not with Jews, not in Israel, but it's a discussion starter on college campuses. It's a discussion starter with progressive young Jews. It's a discussion starter with the mainstream American Protestant churches. It's a way to begin a conversation about what can we do. I mean, if we said to them, well, you can recognize a two-state solution, that's not a discussion that moves anywhere, because number one, it's not going to happen, and number two, it, like I said, absolves them from having to do anything else. But at least when you begin the BDS discussion, it becomes an educational opportunity, a chance to kind of say, let's talk about this and see what is happening, and here's what you can do. It may not be effective in terms of making final change, but it does become a way to open a conversation and educate people.
First, about your son. I don't understand how they wanted to accuse him of being an anti-Semite, because by definition, only a Jew can be an anti-Semite because he knows why. Okay? Okay, but nonetheless.
I'm not touching that.
No, you want me to touch BDS and you don't want that, Jim. Come on, you don't become coward on me, okay? But I think that the position he took is a very right and legitimate one. And your description of the partition, I mean, the visible and invisible partitions is very much there. And we don't have enough time in order to smear the situation. I mean, it's bad enough, and you very gently describe parts of it. But I would like to introduce my mom into the discussion, okay? I mean, we spoke a lot about our children. Let's talk about my mom for a second. We used to ask my mother, Mom, what are you? Are you an optimist or a pessimist? She said, moi, me? Of course I'm an optimist. Today is much better than tomorrow. Now, I somehow have a different kind of optimism, okay? And since you introduced your son and the guy who wants to marry your daughter, and I spoke about my mom, I'd like to talk about my grandson. And I apologize to my beloved students here who heard this story more than once this last couple of weeks, but it's a true one, and for me it's an opening for something. We have 8.5 grandchildren, and 4.5 of them are speaking Arabic, okay? Now, we are Jews, Ashkenazi Jews, not coming from Muslim hemisphere background, and 4.5 of my grandchildren speak Arabic. Here is Yuval, my grandson, 6, 7 years old, came back from school a couple of months ago. And I asked him, Yuval, how was it at school? And he said, Grandpa, it was great. We had a birthday today in school. I said, wow, who celebrated? He said, Saba, Grandpa, Muhammad had a birthday. I said, wow, this is beautiful. What did you bring him as a present? He said, Grandpa, not Muhammad, my friend who lives around the corner. That's the Muhammad who passed away many years ago. The prophet. And I said, wow, that's interesting. Here is my father, one of the founders of the State of Israel, an ordained Orthodox rabbi, okay? His grandson celebrates the birthday of the prophet? Isn't it Jewish evolution? And for me it is. Here you have a generation which is not me who was born into the conflict and the storms of the establishment of the State of Israel, but he is the son of my son who was born already into the stability and the confidence and the frustration of the impasse. And they make an issue to educate their children bilingually and biculturally, with respect, learning Arabic not through the roadblock and not through the security service, the mukhabarat, but through the culture and the daily since day one. And they manufacture the coming elite of both the Israeli and the Palestinian society. It's a bilingual school, 50% Jews, 50% local Palestinians. And if every year you have 200 graduates like this, and in 10 years you will have 2,000 graduates, it's a different society.
Here's the problem. When we poll, Israel is one of the few places, you know, there is a demographic called the millennial. My brother calls them the first globals, largely because of internet. They have a different consciousness. They see themselves as part of a bigger world. And their attitudes on so many issues are fundamentally different than their older
Much more liquid than ours.
The old cohort. Exactly. I was going to say that Israel's the one country where we poll where that demographic is more conservative, and in part because the ultra-Orthodox and the settlers are having so many more kids than the Ashkenazi are. So this liberal current has not taken hold. I will agree with you, though, and it just brought to mind a story that there is a transformation process that takes place. And I spoke at a synagogue here. I was invited to speak at a synagogue in DC, and the rabbi called and asked me if I would talk about the post-9/11 backlash. And I said, absolutely, I'd love to do that. He called me 3 times before the speech to say, please don't talk about the Middle East. I said, I won't, I promise. Second time it was, I told you I won't. Third time it was like, if you really don't want me to come, I don't need to come. I understand he was having problems from his board and he didn't, whatever. I said, I will not talk about it. I went and I gave my talk about the post-9/11 backlash, and every question I got was about the Middle East. And it went well. I mean, my views are not crazy, and their views were
It went perfect. They fired him.
The last question was the only one that created controversy. An old guy gets up, because I'd said at one point that in one of the responses, I'd said something about, look, if you want to talk about the future, I said, I look 100 years down the road, an Arab boy from Amman's going to marry a Jewish girl from Tel Aviv, and they're going to settle in the suburbs of Damascus. That's where we're moving in history. Human history is moving that way. And if you don't like it, tough, because it's going to happen inevitably. Either that or else we're going to blow each other up and continue the killing. It's just whatever. So he raised his hand and he said, so you believe in mixed marriage? And I stopped for a minute and I said, all depends what you mean. My mother and father are both Zogbys, and I don't have 6 toes. They were different branches of the family, but they both came from the same village in Lebanon. But my mother's mother had come from Baskinta, which is a nearby village, and there's a Hatfield-McCoy thing going on right now between them. And so when I went to Lebanon the first time and met my cousins, they were like, his mother's from Baskinta. To them, it was a mixed marriage. I'm Maronite Catholic, Lebanese Catholic. My wife is Irish Catholic. My mother-in-law, the day of the wedding, said, are you sure he's Catholic? To her, it was a mixed marriage. My oldest son's married to a Muslim. My oldest daughter's married to a Jew. My next son is married to a Methodist, and my next daughter is married to a Baptist, and my youngest daughter is gay and is going with a Jewish woman. I said, so I guess I do believe in it. And we call
Jim,
it...
it's a pantheon.
I said, we call it America. And it was interesting, there was a generational divide in the audience. Old people were outraged at my insensitivity, and the young people thought it was just the coolest thing ever. So that's where I hope we're going everywhere.
We are.
Okay.
I took the question to be a cue for questions from you, so...
Ask him about mixed marriages.
So we have microphones. If you would make sure when you ask your question that you have that, please. Thank you.
Can I just do a stereotypical thing? I'm Lebanese, and I have a book that's being sold outside. And if you want to buy it, it's great.
I'm a Jew, and if you sell it, if you give me a good price, I'll buy a copy.
Thanks for a very interesting and informative talk. We talked about a 2-state solution, 1-state solution, but doesn't Israel have their own solution, which is a no-state solution? Israel is a state, but it has no borders, it has no constitution, there is no such thing as an Israeli nationality, and Israel has violated practically all the UN resolutions against them. And recently it's really said that Jews all over the world are really citizens of Israel. So Israel has extended its borders throughout the world, and it seems Israel likes it that way. They seem to want a no-state solution. So I was wondering how you feel about that, and with that, doesn't it mean that whatever is done will have no meaning to Israel? They'll do what they want, and instead of this being just an Israeli and Palestinian problem, it's really an international problem. It's a problem for the world, and for the world really to solve the problem.
Okay. What I love about some forums is that, let's say we come to a dialogue about Israel, which is a Jew and an Israeli and an Arab, but in this case, Arab origin or Lebanese origin and Israeli origin. So it goes like the Arab side goes against Israel, legitimately so, because there is a lot of criticism, and then the Israeli lefty, in order to balance it, goes against Israel. So now we have a balanced power, and we can talk about it. So I feel a little bit uncomfortable because we agreed about so many things. There are other positions as well. I mean, other positions here in America, other positions in Israel, and even other positions in the Arab world today who revere this kind of Israel. I mean, I don't like these people. I don't like the Saudis so much, but I see the way they look at Israel today, and even in other places. And therefore, what I feel is missing here in the panel, as much as I really, and I say it seriously, I enjoyed the conversation, it's not a full spectrum. So you and us together, it's a little bit unbalanced, okay? So let me, instead of answering you, try to explain something. It's a bit easier, it's an academia here, so I can be a little bit more tutorial. There is no doubt that the Israeli Jewish model is different than the nation states born in the West, in the 19th and 20th century. And there is no doubt that the whole issue of Jewish nationality, or moving from Jewish religious definer to a Jewish national definer, the jury is out. We don't yet know what is it. And down the 100 years that Jim put on the table or paved the road towards, I'm not at all sure that by the end of these 100 years, you will not have at least two Jewish people, one defined by the diasporic American way of definition of minorities over here, of diversity over here, and one defined by national definers over there, and it will not have too many common denominators, but maybe the same overarching name Jews. Like you have so many Christians who are so diverse and so different from each other. Having said that, I will try to define something about the Israeli experiment. The victory of Zionism in the Jewish discourse, and remember, up until 1945, the end of the war, the overwhelming majority of the Jews were against the Zionist idea and against the idea of having a sovereign state. Zionism was a minority movement. Various oppositions, not the same opposition, ultra-Orthodox, ultra-Reform, ultra-socialists, but Zionism was a minority movement. So it's a new phenomenon as a majority consensus in the Jewish people today, and the support it got from over here as well. So the victory of Zionism of the Jewish discourse, plus the enhancement of the more conservative elements within the Jewish society within Israel, created a fusion of 5 elements never fused before into one. And I don't speak about a merger, I speak about chemical fusion, that you cannot distinguish between them anymore. For the first time in our history, our collective definition in Israel, not here in America, in Israel, is being defined by the fusion of 5 elements: power, territory, sovereignty, religion, and language. There were times in which we were over the entire land, but we were not necessarily religious. Sometimes we were religious, but we spoke Aramaic or whatever we spoke, but not Hebrew. Sometimes we spoke Hebrew, but we didn't have power. Sometimes we had power, but we didn't have sovereignty. It is the first time that all of these 5 elements are working. And the historic jury is out about one question only. That's the 3rd Jewish Commonwealth. The first one was the biblical one, the second one was the Second Temple one, and that's the 3rd one. At all the 2 previous rounds, it ended when the Jews themselves activated the self-destruction mechanism. The number 1 challenge of the current state of Israel, which is the 3rd Jewish Commonwealth, can we not automatically activate the self-destruction mechanism? The decision whether Israel will continue to be, good or bad, or stop to be, is not anymore the international decision. This is a fact of life. There are worse countries than Israel, even neighboring to us. Even those in which the American president say, I will get along very nice with this Russian president, without mentioning any names. Some of the worst allies of the United States of America are worse than Israel. The decision, the historic decision, will Israel continue to be or stop to be, depends on us only. And I do not really know now what will be my historic perception in 100 years' time looking backwards.
Good. Next question. Yeah, down here.
Thank you. I first asked this question several years ago at the Wilson Center, and unfortunately it's still relevant. Today, Mahmoud Abbas believes that if he makes peace with Israel, he will be assassinated by an Arab extremist. And Benjamin Netanyahu believes that if he makes peace with the Palestinians, he will be assassinated by an Israeli, a Jewish extremist. And they're both right. And the question is, what's the next step?
Kill me, but I have no idea.
Let me say, I don't think on even his best day, Netanyahu thinks if he makes peace with Palestinians, he'll be assassinated, because he has no intention of making peace with Palestinians. Number one, I think that's ideologically, he is a maneuverer who will say, I will support this when he feels the US president is making him say it, but it's a wink and a nod and everyone knows he's not going to, and he's taken every step he can to make sure that solution would never occur, number one. Number two, Mahmoud Abbas may be right, but he has no capacity to make that decision. In other words, no one has ever offered him the reality. You know, I get a kick out of the best deal ever thing. You know, when Ehud Olmert made the proposal to Mahmoud Abbas, his public opinion polling was at about -7 favorable. And he was absolutely in the pits, and he was going to be indicted, and everybody knew it, and so he makes an offer. I mean, only a crazy person would accept that offer, because it never was going to happen. And in the same way, when the Taba negotiations were going on, the Israelis were begging the Palestinians to throw a lifeline to Ehud Barak because he was so low in the polls. I think it was about 5% favorable rating at that point in terms of his job performance. But it was Barak himself who pulled out of the negotiations because he was afraid if he made the deal, that would even cost him more. So we've never really been at the point where there was either the ability or the capacity or the willingness to make that deal. And so the question becomes moot as to whether, it's, you can't say they were afraid to make the deal because there was never a deal to be made and everybody knew it, or they were never going to offer a deal and everybody knew it, and so it's irrelevant. So I think we're beyond deals right now. We're waiting for the deal of the century, which I think we get the sense of where it's going. And my sense is that the Trump deal of the century is, at best, an effort to sound like we're offering something, asking the Israelis not to reject it so that the Palestinians will be the rejectionists, so that the U.S. could then go to the Saudis and others and say, you see, they've rejected it. You should now turn the Arab peace initiative on its head and overtly make ties with Israel as opposed to the covert ties they currently have, so that the deal of the century becomes normalization without peace, as opposed to peace then normalization, which was what the peace initiative was. So this is a best of shell game that's going on.
I totally reject your working assumption. I think that leaders at this position, if they think about something, it's not about will we be killed or not. That's a calculated risk or professional risk. They think about their role in history, especially these two individuals. I think that the place Netanyahu wants in history is the one, another one who did not in his shift, was a compromise over the greater promised land of Israel. That's philosophical, ideological, and even religious in a way. Mahmoud Abbas, if he would have an opportunity tomorrow morning to sign a peace agreement, he would have signed, as is. The issue of being assassinated, yes, Rabin was because of peace and Sadat was because of peace, but it was never a driver not to sign it. This is not why you run for politics and for position.
Back up there.
I'd be interested in hearing the two speakers respond to something that I heard Ami Ayalon say following an appearance he had at the Wilson Center. I asked him about a film made by a Palestinian filmmaker which appeared on Al Jazeera about some of the Arabic language books which are in the Hebrew University Library under the heading Abandoned Property. And some of them actually have book plates saying who the owner was. And they've been there basically since about 1948, 49. And I said to him, it would cost practically nothing to digitize the books that have any research or academic interest. Keep the digital copies, and then give the physical books to Birzeit University or some of the other universities, just as a goodwill gesture. And his answer was, people in Israel are very leery about giving anything back to Arabs. You have to live in the country to feel that. I'd be interested in either or both of your reaction. This was several years ago, I should say.
Look, there's an accounting on all sides that has to be dealt with. I once, after Oslo, had a debate with the president of the Council of Presidents of major Jewish organizations, and he said, my family comes from Austria, and I have no intention ever, no interest at all in ever going back there. And I said, that's how you feel. But I spent time in the refugee camps in Lebanon back in the 70s, and they still carry the key, and they carry the pictures, and there's nothing more in life than they want to go back to their home. It's not even go back to their homeland. They want to go back to their home, their property. And I remember there was one home when the woman showed me a Swedish journalist had been to the village and had taken a picture of the house, and she was crying over the picture that they removed the tree that your uncle planted and they changed the fence in the front and whatever. This was their ancestral home. They wanted it back. Similarly, there are Jews from Arab countries who feel the same. I mean, who feel it. They're Iraqi Jews in particular, who feel very strongly about their roots in Iraq. I had a professor in graduate school who taught Arabic, and he was from Iraq, and then he moved to Israel, and then he came to America, and he had stronger feelings about Iraq than he did about Israel. That was his homeland. And I do feel at some point that a Truth and Justice Commission, or that some form of accounting for this. People have rights. Jews have rights. Arabs have rights. And those rights have to be, you simply don't will them away. They're never going back. They're never getting their property back. It's the issue that nobody wants to touch, but it's the issue that ultimately has to be recognized. And I think that there's a full accounting here that needs to happen. And yet, you know, that remains, that's a chapter we're not ready to open yet to deal with. But I do think that, you know, it's real. There are property issues that have to be talked about. And the entire museum collection in East Jerusalem, Israel took it over. Some of these were owned by individuals who'd given them to the museum. They're not the property of Israel, they're the property of the owners of that museum and of those who lent the articles to the museum. But like I said, I don't think we're ready to tackle it yet, but that clearly is an issue that has to be talked about.
I'd like to move a little bit onwards. I mean, walking the same walk. The day of independence of a couple of years ago, I wrote an article in Haaretz. Haaretz is our New York Times. I mean, as liberal and as read, okay? Or as influential or not anymore, but it's the only newspaper in Israel, let's put it like this. And I wrote an article which says that down to the earth, the Nakba and the independence came down together. And in order to move on, we cannot deny the feelings and the emotions of the other side. And it should start by what I call psychopolitics before politics, understanding, accepting, being sensitive, feeling the trauma of the other rather than competing with it or denying it. And some of the gestures should start within Israel. I mean, as many Palestinian refugees are there around the world, first generation, second generation, whatever generations, within Israel living something like 160,000 Israeli citizens from Palestinian origin who are 48 refugees who are still living in Israel. The land was confiscated, the villages demolished, the property taken away, whatever it is. Solving that problem in a formula which says you do not correct the wrongs of the past by creating new wrongs, but finding solutions for Ikrit and Biram villages, agreed by all governments, agreed by the Supreme Court, to go back to their place. You don't change anything at a demographic balance within the Israeli society, but you improve the attitude, you improve the sensibility, the sensitivity. So Israel should first solve the Palestinian refugees living within Israel. Compensations or any kind of alternative reparations possible, including giving back other property than land, like books, like arts, like whatever it is. When we had a discussion about it with a group of strategic thinking in Israel, and unfortunately they didn't want to listen to me, neither the Jews nor the Palestinians, by the way. We spoke exactly about this, how to do it. I said, listen, I was for many years a member of the group, very small group of Jewish leaders who dealt with the Swiss bankers and few European governments about the restitution of Jewish property, both from Swiss banks Western European museums and Eastern European property held by the government, etc. I told them, take all the precedents that the Jews, the international community, we used in order to persuade these governments to give back the Jewish property, and use it with the Israeli government about the Palestinian property. It's the same argument. There is no difference in the argument. Wherever you can give back property, give back property. If there is no property anymore because it was demolished, because it gives some other financial rewards or compensations or whatever, the Jews in the group said, Avrum, it's too much for us, and the Palestinians said, we don't know how to do it, or we do not dare to do it. But I think the only way to balance the intellectual and the emotional account is to start along this way and to say, listen, Jewish fellows, we recognize your trauma of the Holocaust and we admire the way in which you stop the bloody hatred against all of these people, but find other reconciliatory measures. And we would like to do the same thing with you. Whatever you succeeded to do with Germany, which did to you much more than you ever did to us and we done to you, we would like to have with you. This is the kind of reconciliation possible. I believe that the issue of refugees and the issue of property can become a bridge builder rather than disconnecting the two communities.
Yeah. Let me just second that and say that we've actually done polling on this with refugees in Lebanon and in Jordan. And it's fascinating. If you ask the question straight out, I want to go back. But if you begin to pull apart the question and make it more nuanced, as we did, you find out that ultimately what they want is a recognition that a wrong was done to them. And then they're willing with that to then talk about, okay, how do we move forward? But they need that recognition that something wrong was done. And that's the step that it appears Israel is not ready or willing to take. But at the end, Walid Khalidi wrote a piece years ago called Thinking the Unthinkable. It was about Jerusalem. I actually think it's about the whole conflict, that at some point when the dam breaks and this new consciousness we're talking about is created, we'll be able to think the unthinkable. We'll be able to make these grand gestures. It's sort of it's a complete aside, but I mentioned I have a gay daughter who's now married. 20 years ago, think of where we were in America on that issue. Think 10 years ago where we were. I mean, it was Joe Biden who made a speech that some people said was a slip of the tongue and others said it was a provocative effort, and the dam broke. And today it's like, we're in an entirely different universe on that. I do believe change occurs. You don't know what's going to make it happen, but at some point it's going to occur. And that's why I think that ultimately our challenge is to do what we're doing, create this level of discourse. Even though we agree, others are hearing us and maybe new consciousness is developing. That's why I like BDS. That's why I like Jewish Voice for Peace, and If Not Now. That's why I like the gestures that are taking place in Israel on the buses or on the highways. Years ago when I was running the Palestine Human Rights Campaign, I worked with an attorney, Felicia Langer. I have a picture in my office of her standing over the ruins of a house in Silwan. The house had been demolished by the Israeli military. She'd gone to court to get a stop of demolition order. She never wins. She won this time. She was driving back and got back too late. The house was demolished. And an attorney who worked with her told me the story. He said they were standing around this demolished home and they were lamenting the loss. And they saw her car coming. And somebody said, it's her. It's the Jewish lawyer, the one who defends us. He said, at that point, it occurred to me how absolutely powerful her presence was. Because in this worst of all situations, the occupation then, as bad as it is now, it was 10 times worse in the 70s. he said, in the worst of situations, she held open the possibility that a new relationship could exist. And so I just took that kernel, and I see these kids on the buses, or I see these kids on the highways, and I say, it holds open the possibility of an entirely new set of relationships. It's very important, and I think we'll get there, but who knows what makes the dam break? But the dam will break, and then we'll think the unthinkable.
And I think we'll end there. Thank you so much. Thank you for coming. Don't forget to buy
the
a book.
No, let me just tell you a story about the book. It's about political Zionism and how it dispossessed Palestinians intellectually. I wrote the book 40 years ago and discovered it recently, and a group, Mondo Weiss, came to me and said, you were way ahead of your time. I said, no, I wasn't. I was actually way behind my time. I got most of the stuff I got from research that was already done by others. But as I started reading in Haaretz, and I started reading in the Jewish Forward, a newspaper here in the States, people beginning to ask these questions. Mondo Weiss said, you know, people are now talking about these things. Let's do it. So we republished a book with Mondo Weiss that I'd written 40 years ago, and it's still relevant, unfortunately. So thank you all very much.
Thank you all for coming.